A warm welcome to our IRF in the Context of National Security moderator, Senior Fellow, Pepperdine University, Knox, Thames, and panelists, President and CEO, United States Institute of Peace, Lise Grande, non-resident Senior Fellow, Atlantic Council, Ambassador Nathan Sales, and journalist Siranush Sargsyan.
Good afternoon. Human rights isn't naive idealism, it's the truest form of realism. These are words that the late Senator John McCain spoke in his last book before his death. All of us in this room would agree with those sentiments. We know that religious persecution is a firmly embedded phenomenon impacting hundreds of millions of people around the world every day. And it will likely only continue unless we collectively act. But we know that religious freedom, like other human rights, is strongly correlated with political stability. Many good things happen when people are free to live out their lives as they feel led. But in many of the worst situations of religious persecution, other national security interests take the lead. And so how can we better influence policymakers about the importance of religious freedom? How can we make the case that religious freedom should be a national security priority? What are the convincing arguments that we can make that allowing individuals to practice their beliefs in safety and dignity will be crucial for achieving international peace? We can always make the values argument that religious freedom is a fundamental human right, but we also know that that rarely wins the day in policy debates. We can also make the interest argument. From my time at the State Department, we would often work to translate our religious freedom priorities into a different lexicon, into issues and a context that policymakers focusing on security issues perhaps might value more. But we know that when we've seen religious persecution grow, conflict, instability, and violence aren't far behind. In numerous settings around the world today, we see discrimination against religious groups that is correlated with rising social tensions, conflict, and even mass atrocities. Think about Muslims in India, the Rohingya in Burma, Uyghurs in China, Christians in Pakistan and Nigeria, Yazidis in Iraq, Baha'is in Iran. These and other communities are all subject to forms of violence that have corollary effects on broader prospects for peace and stability. Too often, unfortunately, the US government has been swayed by other exigencies. We've pulled back from defending human rights when we should have pushed forward. We've lacked a serious commitment to extract a cost when we see violations. And when we fail to respond or react too late, needless suffering occurs, but also more importantly, we lose credibility. We constrain ourselves, we lose opportunities to actually expand space for people to live out their beliefs peacefully. Of course, our options are not just limited to a binary, send in the troops or do nothing. We've got the full force, might, and influence of the United States through economic, diplomatic, and even sanctions to push the needle in a positive direction. And to conclude my framing remarks, to go back to Senator McCain and his last book, The Restless Wave, he challenged America to be a force for good in the world. He said, quote, "The moral values and integrity of our nation and the long, difficult, fraught history of our efforts to uphold them at home and abroad are the test of every American generation. Will we act in the world with respect for our founding conviction that all people have equal dignity in the eyes of God and should be accorded the same respect by their laws and the governments of men?" He concluded, "That is the most important question that history asks of us." So we know that the United States shines brightest when we speak up for the oppressed, defend the persecuted, and provide safe haven for the afflicted. The United States can speak truth to power in ways no other country can. We can support victims more effectively than any other nation on earth. It's hard and not always immediately effective, but it's where our interests and values meet. So it's my great honor today to moderate this truly expert panel to help us think through the nexus of religious freedom and national security and the relevance it has for US foreign policy and for other countries that are like-minded with these values. To save time, I'm not going to do long introductions, but the panel here has deep experience both in Washington and around the world. So we should have a great conversation. And I'll first turn to Lise Grande, who's the president and CEO of the United States Institute of Peace. If you're new to Washington, it's a beautiful building at the corner of Constitution Avenue, just as you cross the Potomac. As you know, religious freedom is most commonly understood as a key component of the international human rights agenda. The organization you lead, USIP, its mandate is peace. How do we end violent conflict? How do we promote peace? How do you see the connectedness of international religious freedom in the context of USIP's specific mission?
For colleagues who don't know, Knox is also, we're very lucky at USIP, is also one of our senior fellows. So Knox, it's great to be on the stage with you. Everyone who works for peace and who is committed to global stability and security knows that religious freedom and lasting peace go hand in hand. Countries which repress religious freedom, which don't allow communities and individuals to pursue truth as their conscience lead, in all of those countries, what you see are drivers of social tension. You see intercommunal conflicts being provoked by this repression. And as you said in your opening comments, you often see, unfortunately, terribly, mass atrocities. The relationship between religious freedom, freedom of belief, and long-term stability is absolutely clear in the minds of anyone who really works in this field. What's interesting is how few other people outside of the field don't recognize that in the same way that those of us who are peace builders recognize it. I think one of the very important things about a summit like this, Knox, is that it's an opportunity for people who are in the human rights camp and people who are in the national security camp to find common cause, to enlarge the coalition of people who are committed to upholding this principle of international religious freedom and to working together. And that's why it's such a privilege for me to be here with you today.
Great, that's perfect remarks. And this is a great segue to Nathan Sales, who was an assistant secretary overseeing the Bureau of Counterterrorism at the State Department during the Trump administration, but also has worked in the human rights field when he oversaw the entire human rights, the multiple bureaus that deal with human rights at the State Department. Nathan, you've been on both sides of this issue. Can you just tell a bit about how these issues landed when you were doing CT work, and how did you see the world as it related to religious freedom?
Yeah, absolutely, Knox. National security and religious freedom go hand in hand. And you can make an even broader point. National security and human rights writ large go hand in hand. It's really striking. If you compare two maps, let's do an overlay of a map showing globally countries that respect or don't respect religious freedom. And then on top of that, let's overlay a map showing the world's hotspots, where conflict is great or where conflict is low. And what is really striking is the dramatic correlation between countries that have a poor track record when it comes to respecting religious freedom on the one hand, and the level of social instability and outward directed violence emanating from those countries. There's both an internal dimension to this and an external dimension to this. Countries that tend not to respect religious freedom internally experience high degrees of social conflict, often spills out into violence. The governments are normally structured as authoritarian regimes or even totalitarian regimes. And then the external dimension is that, what happens in Vegas doesn't stay in Vegas. Violence and instability within a country tends to spill over beyond its borders and infect neighbors and indeed the entire region in which the country is located. A couple of examples. China. The People's Republic of China is perhaps the world's greatest violator when it comes to religious freedom. For years, Tibetan Buddhists, practitioners of Falun Gong, have been in the crosshairs of the Chinese Communist Party. I don't need to tell this group what's happening to the Muslim Uyghurs in Western China. The Trump administration declared that this was a genocide. The Biden administration, to its credit, has continued that determination. And even more recently, we've seen the Catholic Church and other Christian denominations under extraordinary pressure, to the point that the Bible is now being rewritten. Call it Christianity with she characteristics. Remember when Jesus says to the adulterous woman, let he among you who's without sin cast the first stone? Well, in the Chinese Communist Party's version, Jesus casts the stone and stones the woman to death. This is what we're facing in China. Russia, Iran, for instance, this used to be the most hospitable country in the region for Jews. Now Tehran proclaims death to Israel, and doesn't just proclaim it with words, proclaims it with deeds, funding hundreds of millions of dollars being directed into terrorist groups like Hamas, like Hezbollah, and others, aimed at eradicating Jews and eradicating the Jewish state. So if you want to protect national security, if you want peace, if you want stability, the first thing you need to do is have a proper understanding of the human person and their need for freedom of conscience and respect their right to freedom of religion.
All right, thank you. And now we're going to go from a high-level view of the issue to a view from the ground. And Siranush is a journalist from Nagorno-Karabakh. She covered the blockade. She was there when the Azerbaijani troops moved in, and she is now a refugee, along with her family in Armenia. Can you tell us about the situation for your community as it is now and what's happening in Nagorno-Karabakh?
Thank you. On the backstage, I read a tweet on UN Refugee Agency page. It is written, tell story of refugee. During these last years, I was telling stories of 120,000 Christian Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh, people who now become a refugee. We all have our stories, and our stories are different, but also they are the same. Just in 1 year, last year, we experienced 9 months blockade, 2 days war, and then become a refugee. We lost our country. Just to you understand, Nagorno-Karabakh, it's a unique, very unique community with its own culture, identity. And most of our population have never left their home, never. And for them, it's very hard to imagine them like outside of their community. Last day, when I left my home, I was with 82 years old woman who was also leaving her village. And she said, like, this is first time when she lived. And she was with her 3 sons and 8 grandchildren. And this is like one story, like how whole village, whole community was displaced. Like, if I come back, I want to share my story, because this is also the story of others. I was grown up near the Amaras Church, one of the oldest church, 4th century church, Christian church. And in that church was the first Armenian school. But it was not just a church. Near that church was our villagers create vineyard, mulberry yard, and we were living there. We were creating our life there. And I remember, even when I was student, I was working during harvest. It was like obligatory. Like, we all leave our job, everything, and came there. And with this community, we were doing this. So now we are not only lost our country, our home, but all our history, our tradition. And for us, it's very hard, because we left, every community have this own church, own story, but also during these 4 wars, every family lost someone. Like my family, in every war lost someone. And we have family who lost like all their family members. And we not only lost we lost their graves, now they are there. And we are deprived now even visit our churches. Armenians celebrate Christmas in January. And this is first time during the history, like in our churches, there is a silent, there is no liturgy, there is nothing. And this is, if we compare like 4 months ago when we were already in Armenia after forced displacement, maybe first months we couldn't recognize that because we were somehow relieved, like we are survived. Because during blockade, it was not just a blockade, it was starvation siege. 9 months, Azerbaijan starved us, did everything. And when we were like literally, we were exhausted, they just attack and people just somehow survive. But now, when you talk to these people, they compare their life and they even dream about that life in blockade, without food, without anything. But at least they live in their homes, because especially, like, imagine mothers who lost their son's grave there, they feel guilty and they want to go there. And I'm not talking about our churches, their future. We don't know what will happen with them. We already have a lot of information, like how several churches were destroyed or converted, or they expressed like it's Albanian churches. So, and several cemeteries it's already destroyed, demolished. And of course, every time when you see that, you feel like it's your relatives, it's your story. So from this point of view, for us, it's very important, like, as a community, as a Christians, as a people who lived there for 1,000 years. This is first time. Like Armenians, they are not living in their place. Like, we have that chance to go back and live in our homes.
Yeah. We've got a few minutes left. I want to ask a question just for Lise and Nathan, and then come to you, Siranush, but being mindful of the time. USIP on Monday hosted an event to remind everyone of the 10th anniversary of the Yazidi genocide that's coming up. Nathan, you've seen the heinous attacks of terrorists in your work at CT. How do you convince policymakers who are busy, who are juggling other things, that what's happening to communities like in Nagorno-Karabakh matter to U.S. foreign policy? How would you make that case? Can you give us some tips based on when you've engaged senior officials? How do we make the case that religious freedom matters?
I think one of the things that's been so positive about the way that the issue of international religious freedom is being handled by our government is the insistence that people who are about to go out to the field, to go to other countries, who represent the United States, are trained. They're trained on international religious freedom. They're trained to uphold it. I think this makes all the difference in the world. If our diplomats go out and they don't know how this field works, if they don't know how to promote it, they're not going to be as effective as if they are trained. Yeah. And because of the International Religious Freedom Act, they are. Yeah. I think this is incredibly positive.
Yeah. I think it's all about making the case that it is in our interest to advance these principles. We're not saying that international religious freedom matters only because it's the right thing to do. That's true. It is an important value. It's intrinsically valuable, but it's also instrumentally valuable. Religious freedom helps bring about certain strategic states that are in the interest of the United States. And so, sometimes diplomats have to make hard choices, balance this country against that country, balance this issue against that issue. When it comes to religious freedom, you actually can have your cake and eat it too in many cases. I picked on China before. I'll pick on the CCP again. It's kind of my brand. I don't think the audience is going to push back too much on this. Religious freedom is one of our great comparative advantages when we compete against the Chinese Communist Party. It's a way of doing the right thing. Standing for these principles is a way of doing the right thing. It's also a way of imposing great pressure on China, making it harder for China to make relationships around the world. So you can stand up for victimized Falun Gong, you can stand up for Muslim Uyghurs, you can stand up for Catholics in the underground church, and at the same time advance your strategic interests in the region and globally.
Yeah. We do the right thing, it's also a good thing to do, and having our diplomats understand that, two key components. Siranush, I'm going to give you the final word. What would be your message to Washington, D.C. about why the United States should be mindful of what's happening there?
Well, what's happened in Nagorno-Karabakh, it's not just ethnic cleansing. It's genocide, it's annihilation of first Christian nation. It's fact. And for us, West always was keeping tradition of Christianity. Armenians will always look at West like this. And Armenian genocide happened more than 100 years ago. It happened now, but even now it is not stopped. Now Armenia also in danger, but not also Armenia. If we will not take any kind of step, this kind of situation can happen any other religious minorities. But I want to be clear. I don't want to it was just a word, because during blockade, 9 months, we heard a lot that word. I want to make one example. 1 week before the last war, when we had to leave our country, U.S. High Official Yuri Kim said, United States will not tolerate any kind of military intervention or ethnic cleansing. But we know what's happened. I just want to we understand, and at least we value our words. At least politicians value their words, what they are doing.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, let's give a round of applause to our panelists. Thank you. All right, Siranush, we'll go up.